Overcoming by Purefoysgirl. Chapter 15. Hannibal wound up riding the reluctant Dimon nag all the way back to Hertford House, having long ago left behind the possibility that Will had missed catching the ducal coach and been left stranded. Indeed, upon his arrival, Mr. Hawkes informed him that Will had already gone upstairs to bed. Hannibal grimly strode up the stairs and down the hallway to Will's suite, rapping sharply on the door only once before twisting the knob and letting himself in. Will's blue eyes flashed with annoyance as he slid from his bed and turned his back, still attempting to pull on a robe to cover his nightclothes, his book tumbling from his lap to the floor. "Is there some emergency, Lord Clarges?" he asked, head dipped as he belted his robe, giving Hannibal a decidedly pleasant view of his narrow waist and straight shoulders. "Or are you mistaken rooms once more?" "You worried me taking off in such a manner," Hannibal told him, standing there in the doorway, momentarily forgetting why he was here and wondering if he was, in fact, getting soft in the head. The memory of Will's slender body pressed to his returned with frightening clarity, enough so to temporarily distract him from his purpose. "It was not my intention to worry you," Will said, turning to face him with his arms crossed over his chest and his chin tipped up in defiance. "Merely to escape me?" Hannibal queried, his eyes falling to Will's slender throat, searching for signs of a mark. Will nervously reached up and pinched the top of his robe closed in his fist, hoping to cover himself enough to lose Hannibal's sudden and unwelcome interest. "Merely to relieve you," Will corrected. "And while we are on the subject, my plans are settled to leave Hertford House after your grandfather's party." "You will do nothing of the sort," Hannibal announced, shocked into blurting out the first thing he could think of to put a stop to it. "I forbid it." "You forbid it? And how do you propose to stop me, Lord Clarges?"
"It would be entirely foolish to tell you,"
Hannibal hedged, having no idea. Usually the threat of his authority was enough to force obedience, but he wasn't surprised that his authority carried no weight with his increasingly angry little spouse. Will had no use for, or patience with, such nonsense, and Hannibal well knew it. Will smiled at his attempt to cow him, cocking his head slightly to one side, knowing he hadn't the faintest clue.
"Stop being so smug, damn you," Hannibal said, annoyed. "You are my spouse, Will, and Hertford House is your home. You will remain here where you belong."
"No," Will said, the single word heavy with anger, despite how softly he spoke it.
"I will not. I do not require your permission for anything, if you recall."
Hannibal stared at him in consternation, rankled that Will could so easily dismiss him. After a long, silent moment, he managed to ask,
"And where will you go? To Marsham Heath, is it?"
"That is none of your business."
"To the contrary, it is entirely my business,"
Hannibal said, wondering with sudden suspicion if he had plans instead to flee to the Alpha he was bound to. Surely they were furious, whoever they were, to have their Omega sharing space with another Alpha. Hannibal himself would certainly never stand for it.
"Or is there something you have neglected to tell me about,
"What on earth are you talking about, Hannibal?"
"I'm talking about the fact that I know you are bonded,"
Hannibal said, deciding to play Bedelia's card. Will drew in a shocked breath, momentarily blanking at his announcement. Pure, unadulterated fear gripped him then, because if Hannibal knew, if he even suspected that Will had formed a bond to him, then he would have absolute control, and Will was far too smart to dream he would be careful with him when there was every possibility Hannibal wanted him dead. Hannibal felt his sudden anxiety like a throbbing punch in his gut, and he snarled softly, demanding, "Who is it?" Will's relief was so keen he almost laughed, but Hannibal's anger was palpable, frightening in its intensity, and it quickly chased away everything but dread that rapidly escalated to pure fury when Hannibal asked,
"Anthony, perhaps?"
"How dare you!" Will snarled, forgetting to hold tight to his robe, forgetting that he had a secret to protect, forgetting that this man had in all likelihood attempted to kill him once already. All of it was flung onto the fire of his anger with the Alpha before him. "Casting aspersions on others and keeping none for yourself. How dare you say that to me?" Hannibal pushed away from the door and took a step toward him, only to immediately chastise himself for forgetting Will's penchant for violence. He was prevented from taking another step by his furious little mate, proving that he was, in fact, quite capable of brandishing a rather heavy marquetry table before him in dire warning for Hannibal to keep his distance. "There is no one bound to me," Will hissed, and quite honestly so, because his bond only went one way, chaining him to the man before him, while leaving Hannibal quite free.
"Why should I believe you?"
Hannibal asked, his tone nasty, all of his old, ugly beliefs about Omegas rising up against his reason, ready and eager to believe the worst of his mate. But by all the gods, he was lovely when he was riled, Hannibal had to admit that. He looked half wild and ready to do battle, heedless of his robe gaping open over his pale skin, unknowing of the picture he made with his blue eyes shooting sparks and his red mouth parted in a snarl, a vengeful god roused to righteous retribution. Hannibal was so distracted that he almost didn't react in time to bat the table away when Will flung it at him. His anger died abruptly when Will sharply said to him, "Because while you have been unfaithful to me in every imaginable capacity, Lord Clarges, I have never once been unfaithful to you." Hannibal subsided, grimacing at how deep that barb went, chastened by the sight of Will standing before him in the tatters of his pride, panting with the force of his rightful fury. "And should you ever imagine accusing me of such vile and shameful behavior," Will said, his volume softening but not his anger, "then I assure you, Lord Clarges, that I will cosh you with the heaviest piece of furniture I can lift, and step over you on my way to find a lover, for I will not be charged guilty of a crime without committing it." It took Hannibal a long, reflective moment to finally manage, "You are profoundly unsettling, William Graham." "And you are remarkably self-righteous for a man with the morals and deportment of an alley cat," Will said, trying to regain control of himself now that Hannibal's anger had died such a quick and surprising death. "One must be careful of casting stones, Hannibal, when one is king of a glass castle." Hannibal frowned, disliking the chastisement, but accepting it. There was every chance that Bedelia was wrong, or baiting him somehow, and Hannibal had no way of knowing. All he knew for certain was that Will had been honest in every exchange they'd had since the moment they met, no matter if his opinions irritated Hannibal or exposed a flaw he was ashamed to have bared.
"If you say there has been no one, then I believe you,"
he said, surprising himself as much as Will with his honesty. Will was startled into looking over at him, his blue eyes widening with shock, knowing it must have peeled an entire layer off Hannibal's pride to say such a thing. He felt the tug of his bond to Hannibal luring him closer, enticing him to soothe away the flustered, irritated, and vulnerable look on his husband's handsome face. And beneath that face lay the echo of a child fleeing the violent deaths of his family through rain-soaked, blackened woods, orphan and bereft. It softened Will without his intending it to, that image, that child who would always be there trapped in memories of brutal horror, rushing water and loss and guilt for surviving when those he loved had not. That they had loved him in return only made it all the harder for Will to ignore it. He knew how dearly he would have suffered in Hannibal's place, losing a family who cared about him. Will couldn't tell what provoked him to act. He didn't dare try to analyze his own motives in that moment. Was it the child he hoped to soothe, or the man? Was it his empathy or Omegan weakness? It didn't seem to matter. All that mattered was the outcome. Will moved closer to him and reached out to take his hand. Hannibal snatched Will's slender fingers in his on impulse and asked, "What are you doing?" It came out sharper than he intended with his surprise, and Will retreated, attempting to free his hand from Hannibal's fingers. He tightened his grip and tugged, asking with less force, "Is something wrong?" "No, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have touched you like that," Will said, flustered with growing mortification. No doubt the last thing in the world that Hannibal wanted touching him was the repellent and ugly Omega he'd been forced into marriage with. "That was thoughtless of me, not to mention incredibly rude, Will," Hannibal said, somewhat exasperated that they were essentially in a tug of war over Will's hand. He gave him another tug that half dragged Will against him, and said, "Just tell me what you're about." At a loss, Will lifted his trapped hand and pressed the back of Hannibal's fingers beneath his jaw. His voice quavered with nerves when he told him, "See for yourself." "See what?" Hannibal asked, releasing Will's hand to turn his fingertips to his throat. It was the first time in 6 years that he had seen it completely bare, and he lost track of his thoughts again while searching the soft, smooth skin of Will's neck. It was more slender than he'd expected, almost delicate, and clearly unmarked, much to his relief. Clearing his throat a little to chase down the sudden tightness that threatened, he spread his hand along the side of Will's neck and paused, momentarily forced into stillness by the thrumming beat of Will's pulse beneath his palm. He tested his scent, the lush fragrance of fertile youth, even stronger than it had been at Fernhill. But he could taste no fear, just something fragile and delicate as spun glass that even the softest of touches could destroy. "See?" Will said, forcing a lightness into his voice that sounded strained and anxious even to his own ears. "No bite marks." Reluctant to give up the warm contentment he felt touching Will even so little, Hannibal brought his other hand up to cup Will's neck and keep him from retreating, saying, "I told you I believed you." Will flushed, feeling awkward standing as he was in his robe and nightclothes, with his throat trapped in Hannibal's large, warm hands while those sensitive fingers spread over his skin. "Sometimes seeing is believing," Will murmured, the pressure of Hannibal's fingers changing softly as he spoke. The warm, earthy scent of his skin filled Will's lungs with every breath, prickling his senses as surely as the calloused fingertips trailing over his throat. The touch brought goosebumps rippling over him, and the mocking echo of his father's voice whispered that this touch was what he'd been after in the first place, a deeply desperate bid for attention after the revelations of the evening. It scalded him to think that he was so weak after all, just another Omega driven by heats and instinct, pathetic in Hannibal's eyes. The very sour despondence of his thoughts should have ruined it for him. The fact that Hannibal's touch only comforted him made it all the worse. He nearly shuddered to feel the sure quest of fingers down the length of his throat, testing every inch of his supple skin, even into the loose collar of his robe, impulse urging him to allow Hannibal to do more, to do anything he desired. It was terribly dangerous, this closeness. He could feel his bond to Hannibal strengthening, more threads weaving into the fabric that anchored him to his alpha, a relentless pull dragging him closer and closer to inevitable destruction, broken on sharp stones and scattered to rough seas. When Hannibal slid his hand beneath the fabric of his nightclothes to seek the soft skin of his shoulder, his amber eyes hazy as if caught in a dream, sudden panic drowned out everything else. The cliff of his nightmares loomed up in Will's imagination, the promise of what awaited him should he freely indulge his impulses, or should Hannibal ever discover the twisted nature of Will's bond to him. It shocked Will enough that he pulled back sharply, gasping, "What are you doing?" "Seeing if you were bitten on your shoulder," Hannibal said, clenching his empty hands into fists to trap the warmth and scent of Will's flesh on his fingers, sweet and compelling. "I was doing you a courtesy, Lord Clarges," Will said, righting his clothing with a sharp tug, surprised that Hannibal had dared to do such a thing. Then again, considering his opinions on Will's capacity to seduce, it was very likely that Will could strip naked in front of him and garner no more than a raised eyebrow at his gall. "No one has bitten me anywhere, for God's sakes. That was the point." "You didn't have to go to such extremes, Will," Hannibal said, dropping his hands to his sides, head tipping to chase that sweet, elusive scent that eddied about him. "I have no cause or right to criticize you, considering my past behavior, though I am not complaining of your insistence." Will managed a scandalized and dangerous little growl that almost made him smile. "Have I agitated you? Thank goodness there is nothing too deadly at hand with the table out of reach." "Would it content you to know that I am, in fact, beating you quite soundly with a fish in my imagination?" Will asked, doing a poor job of covering his throat with the lapels of his robe, his hands visibly trembling. He retreated, an impulse bid for safety which Hannibal, thankfully, did not deny him. "What would content me, Will, is knowing that you will not beat a hasty retreat from Hertford House without provocation," Hannibal said, circling back around to distract himself from thinking of Will's fragile throat. "You feel I haven't been provoked?"
"Will,"
Hannibal said, uncomfortable and feeling in the wrong.
"What was said tonight—"
"You owe me nothing, Lord Clarges," Will said, mortified all over again by the memory of what had been said, of the events that had taken place at the tailor shop, of everything that had occurred since Hannibal's return home. He took a deep breath and forced it all down as best he could. "Least of all an explanation. However you choose to speak of me to those who know you best is your own affair. Though I expected better from you as a gentleman than to gossip openly of our marriage." A spasm of regret passed through Hannibal at that. Very softly he said,
"It was wrong of me to speak of you to anyone in such a way, Will. You have done nothing to earn my disparaging words."
"Nonsense," Will told him, hugging himself for comfort as he said the words he knew were expected, hammered into him from his earliest awareness. "I exist, Lord Clarges. That is offence enough on its own. I tricked your family into a marriage under false pretenses, forced you from your home, and then stole it from you. But allow me to make one thing clear, Hannibal. Were it not for the Duke forbidding it, I would have gone from Hertford House 6 years ago." Hannibal flinched, his amber eyes flicking over Will's slender body, noting the way he held himself, a pitiful comfort from painful truths. Distress etched every line of his face, bowing his full mouth down into a frown. Frustration and anger were there, too, simmering beneath the surface, a justified, unacknowledged response to what life had heaped on his head. "Please don't look so surprised," Will said, his voice strained, his eyes deliberately fixed to one side, face averted. "Did you honestly believe I wished to stay here when they told me you had gone? I was mortified by what had happened, Hannibal, and tried everything in my power to change it. You aren't the only one who begged the Duke for an annulment. Since the day I met you—" The hitch in his voice thinned Hannibal's mouth, and his fingers clenched without realizing it, a twitch of response to somehow negate the still raw pain in his mate's soft voice. "Since the day I met you, all I've wanted is to go away." Will's large, glittering blue eyes lifted to his usual reserve abandoned to show the true pain within. His voice was a silky soft whisper of regret when he said, "I'm as trapped in this debacle as you are." Hannibal swallowed hard, fighting the urge to haul Will up into his arms and soothe such ugliness from him. The thought of Hertford House and an heir were far from his mind at that moment, rendered down to petty trivialities in the face of what he had cost Will these 6 long years.
"Please, do not leave Hertford House," he said,
the idea of Will's absence just wrong somehow, a shadow that would remain to haunt the halls with his presence. "I can only say, Lord Clarges," Will said, desperate for him to go away, "that I will at least inform you before I go. But I will be leaving." Hannibal sighed, rubbing his forehead with resignation, and nodded slightly at him.
"That is more courtesy than I have ever shown you,"
he admitted, and showed himself out, leaving Will flushed and disturbed and quietly trembling behind him. Hannibal returned to his own suite, somber and thoughtful in the wake of his clash with Will. Berger was bustling about the room, busy turning down the covers and lowering the lamps. He did a double take when Hannibal walked in, and said with a soft chuckle,
"You look like you've been put through the ringer, my lord." "I certainly feel as though I have."
Hannibal sighed, flopping down into the nearest chair with a heavy sigh.
"My spouse would have made a formidable general."
"That's so, my lord?" Berger inquired, politely interested.
"Seems a pleasant and quiet little fellow to me." "It's the quiet ones you must be wary of, Berger," Hannibal warned him. "They are far too intelligent to give themselves away with words." He frowned slightly, absently tapping his fingers on the chair's arm, trying to order his thoughts. His own exasperated, proud observation of Will brought back his grandfather's words on omegas. It seemed weeks since that conversation in the library, when the Duke had so casually surmised that there were omegas in the military. Seeing Will in a high and righteous fury, knowing what he now knew, it did not seem so unbelievable a thought, and he asked, "Did you know of any omegas in the military, Berger?" His valet's hand stuttered, and he flinched, answer enough in Hannibal's book. Yes, my lord, Berger admitted, coming to him when Hannibal got up and began to undress. Quite a few of 'em, as a matter of fact. Took all manner of meds to keep 'em from being outed, they did. Some even cut the scent glands out. Less risky, in my opinion. And how, pray tell, did you find out they were Omegas if they were so cleverly hidden?
Hannibal asked, both irritated that his grandfather might have been right, and annoyed that he himself had somehow not realized.
When they needed treatment, they came to me first, Berger said, cringing through the words as he helped Hannibal undress. They was, scared of you, my lord. Scared of me, Hannibal echoed, aghast. Me, a doctor, oftentimes the only doctor. What on earth were they scared of? That you'd have them thrown into prison for being Omegas, Berger said, not meeting his glare. That you'd expose them, turn them out to some strange land, some of them. Some of them changed their minds in the end. About me? Hannibal asked, feeling offended by their opinion of him. About being treated, my lord, Berger said, ashamed. They decided they was better off healing up as they could without risking it.
Hannibal was speechless with horror, trying to summon to mind a world where someone would refuse treatment from pure fear of the source.
No, he said, the word faint and baffled. That cannot be true. Omegas have no business fighting in a war. I've seen grown alphas packed off screaming from the battlefront. There is no possible way an Omega could manage such pressure.
He broke off abruptly. A month ago, he would have said no Omega could bear up for 6 years after a harsh rejection, bring an estate from teetering brink of ruin to fruitful productivity, or threaten an alpha with nothing more than their mind as a weapon. Unsettling indeed.
My lord, all manners of Omegas was in the last unit,
Berger said, intruding on his sudden reflective thoughts.
That's why they was so skittish of you.
Hannibal frowned, recalling Captain Rogers' unit. He'd thought them all too young for duty and had mentioned it to Rogers, had asked him if the draft age had been lowered. He recalled clearly how Rogers had laughed at that and had shaken his head, greatly amused by something Hannibal found entirely bereft of humor.
That simply cannot be the case, he said, sure that Berger was having him on. The alphas would have known. I would have known. Captain Rogers had mostly beta males and Omegas, not so many alphas besides himself, Berger said with a shrug. He swore by all his men, whatever they did up between their legs. It never made a difference to him, and honestly, he never was good at recognizing an Omega, my lord.
Hannibal was entirely confused.
Berger, they were a forward unit. I distinctly recall they had an unusual number of sharpshooters. Oh, aye, my lord, vicious clever with their guns they were,
Berger agreed, settling Hannibal's coat on a hanger with reverence.
I certainly wouldn't want to run up against an Omega in a war. They got the most to lose of anybody, ain't they? What on earth do you even mean?
Hannibal asked, thumbing through his memories of Captain Rogers' unit for clues he must have glossed over and finding none. They had hidden themselves and done so well enough to fool even a doctor of his standing.
I mean, they got a man's own need to protect his interests, and a mother's need to protect her young, Berger said, as if it made perfect sense. Nothing more determined to win than that, is there?
Hannibal mulled that over, unable to find fault with the reasoning, and unable to find chaos in the unit he'd left behind. There should have been chaos by all rights, but it had been no less disciplined or effective than any other unit he'd been assigned to.
Berger, those Omegas who did not come to me for treatment, did they survive?
A few, Berger said, buttoning him up into his nightshirt and missing the spasm of pain that crossed Hannibal's face.
The others made sure Captain Rogers would settle their pensions on their families. A soldier who dies in the field is worth more than an Omega court-martialed out of the military, isn't he?
Hannibal impatiently took over, needing to move, to do something. Breathlessly, he said,
They should have come to me. They were scared, my lord, Berger said, bending to gather up Hannibal's boots. Better scared than dead, Hannibal snapped at him. I would have treated them. If you'll pardon my saying so, my lord, your opinions on Omegas was fair clear to all who heard them, Berger said, conversational as if they were discussing the weather. There's some risks a body won't take when they stand to lose their livelihood. Better to die in a strange land then, let the money go home where it can do some good, right?
Hannibal wrinkled his nose at that, angry, guilty, wondering how many deaths he was inadvertently responsible for. How many Omegas had chosen the betterment of their families instead of their own health for fear he would see them drummed out and penniless? In all honesty, he wasn't sure himself how he would have reacted to finding an Omega on the battlefield, and that scalded him, shamed him deeply, because it was just that uncertainty that had cost the lives of brave soldiers.
My lord? I honestly had no idea.
Well, they was careful you didn't, Berger assured him, moving to gather up his other discarded clothing.
They was just soldiers, my lord. They had to defend their country, same as us.
Yes, Hannibal said, thinking of all the faces he'd seen in his near decade overseas, wondering how many of them had fought with the added element of being exposed and reviled for their gender.
Yes, I suppose they were.
Reflective and riddled with guilt, Hannibal retreated to his bed, his thoughts of the war becoming terrible dreams that so often plagued him, where blood never ceased flowing, where men never ceased dying, where the boom of cannons and the crack of gunfire became the anguished sobs of the soldiers he'd failed to save. Will's restless sleep was spent in nightmares of cliffs, and parties full of people pointing their fingers at him, laughing at him, of his sister whispering over and over that he was not safe, of Hannibal waltzing him closer and closer to the crumbling cliff edge while the watching crowd roared with laughter at his ignorance. It was not at all restful or conducive to good health, but it did leave him waking thoughtful and sheened with sweat, flushed enough that Jimmy inquired if he was coming down ill. "No, Jimmy, please don't trouble yourself," Will assured him, grateful for the cool, damp cloth his valet provided with wordless, pursed-mouthed disbelief. Will wiped his damp skin with it and washed his face in the basin, relishing the cold water on his skin. "Jimmy, when did you arrive here at Hertford House?"
"Oh, let me see," Jimmy said, helping Will get dressed in the near darkness. "It was, 10 years ago?"
Will frowned softly, musing. "You never knew Hannibal before his return from the war?"
"No, Mr. Graham,"
Jimmy said, buttoning him up in the clothing that made him feel so much safer. "Just curious?" "My sister mentioned a former Lady Clarges," Will said, and noted the way that Jimmy's hand stilled. It was only a split second, but it was enough to prompt him to say, "He was married once before." Jimmy turned to his cuffs, focusing on his task and absently saying,
"Zeller would know more about it than I would, Mr. Graham. He's been here since childhood."
"As he reminds me at every possibility," Will said, thinking of the Duke's rather lazy and lackadaisical valet who, most times, was conspicuously not assisting his Grace. "I doubt I could get answers out of him."
"Oh, if you manage to, Mr. Graham, will you tell me?" Jimmy teased, his eyes lighting up with his usual ebullience. "I've been trying since I arrived here to turn that particular latch."
Will laughed and stepped away from him, pulling his boots on and tapping his heels to situate them. He glanced back and caught Jimmy gazing at him, assessing him with his head cocked to one side. "What? What is it?"
"It's nothing,"
Jimmy assured him, his wide smile back in place.
"It's just unusual for you to ask questions now after all this time."
"Jimmy," Will said, angling a repressive look at him. "Whatever you're thinking, it isn't that."
"No, of course not. I know that," Jimmy said, waving it away with one hand.
"It would be absurd."
"Of course, Mr. Graham, absolutely out of the question."
"Entirely baseless supposition," Will said, hoping he could quell that assessing, figuring look in Jimmy's eyes before his valet started attempting to mend fences torn down too long ago to be fixed now.
"Naturally, your curiosity has nothing at all to do with Lord Clarges returning, Mr. Graham," Jimmy agreed, amused by Will's scowl. "Might I suggest asking his Grace? He does adore you. I doubt there's anything he would hesitate to discuss with you."
"I can't agree, Jimmy. Hannibal's cousin intimated that the Duke himself has kept me ignorant of any family matters, including the accident that took his son." Jimmy blinked at that, but it was only a momentary setback before he said,
"I'm sure it's just because he didn't want to worry you about it, Mr. Graham. He does value your peace of mind and happiness. I'm sure he'd be more than happy to enlighten you, if only to give you the truth in place of rumors."
Will chewed his lower lip for a moment, thought churning furiously. "I'll consider it, Jimmy, thank you. You can go, take some time for yourself." He did debate just asking the Duke, but he was reluctant to explain himself, reluctant to bring Mina into things and potentially open Pandora's box in regards to the Duke's own role. He had to consider that, if the rest were true, so too was the mention that grandfather had compensated the young woman's family for her death, possibly in an attempt to keep them from inquiry. It was unnerving to think that he could not trust the man he'd grown so fond of in the past 6 years. But Will knew he couldn't be sure of anything, not even whether Hannibal was responsible for the accident with his saddle. He kept his own counsel through his meager breakfast, and then took the matter to Mr. Hawkes, who seemed surprised at his curious inquiry.
"The family graveyard, Mr. Graham?"
he echoed, momentarily surprised by Will's unusual question.
"It is tended by the groundskeepers, yes."
"I should like to visit it, Mr. Hawkes," Will said, hoping the aging butler wouldn't ask too many questions. "Strangely, as well as I know Hertford Estate, I've no idea where the Lecters are laid to rest."
"Ah," Mr. Hawkes said, nodding sagely. "That is because the family graveyard is somewhat removed from the estate, Mr. Graham. It lies over the crest of the western ridge near Duxbury."
Will's eyes widened a little as he figured how far that was. He had never ventured over the western ridge, lacking any reason to, and couldn't contain his curiosity from asking, "Why is it so far away, Mr. Hawkes?"
"Hertford House was once settled there, Mr. Graham," he was told. "A century ago there came terrible rains that flooded the entire first story. The Duke, his Grace Ferris Lecter, had Hertford House moved brick by brick here to its current location to prevent such a thing from ever happening again."
Will couldn't fathom what such an effort must have cost, how long it must have taken, and he was properly awed.
"Those who had previously departed could not, of course, be disturbed,"
Mr. Hawkes intoned, his sonorous voice knocking Will's chest.
"After the flood waters receded, the cemetery was repaired, and staff have tended it faithfully since."
Will nodded, absorbing what he'd been told. "It is very good of them to remember their family," he said, thinking wistfully of the unkempt family plot on his father's estate, the names and dates worn away to anonymity for the most part, the stones growing moss-covered and crumbling towards the back.
"Stop fretting over the state of that place. You will never lie there, William."
Will shuddered from remembering the anger in his father's voice, and shook his head, saying, "Mr. Hawkes, I will be visiting the cemetery today, as soon as I possibly can. Please have my horse saddled."
"Yes, Mr. Graham. And might I suggest having Mrs. Pymmes make you up a basket lunch?"
"Yes, Mr. Hawkes, that would be perfect. I think a little solitude after yesterday is just what I need."
"It is quite a peaceful and lovely place, Mr. Graham,"
Mr. Hawkes said, smiling at him.
"The perfect place to read quietly and reflect on what is important in one's life."
Will gave him a weak smile and moved to the front door, hoping he could be gone before Hannibal made an appearance. He was desperate for some time to think, to consider what Mina had told him, and what Hannibal professed to require of him. He needed to look and see if this previous wife was laid to rest there, and make his inferences from that. He wondered if she had displeased him somehow. He wondered if, perhaps, she had not been capable of providing Hannibal with the heir he required, the heir that Hannibal now claimed to want from Will, despite his former statements to the contrary. Will's hand dropped to his belly, spreading to cover the place where a baby might flourish, if Hannibal had his way. He had always been told by the Duke that if he gave Hannibal an heir, then he would have nothing more to be concerned about, and could raise his child here under the Duke's watchful eye, while Hannibal would, no doubt, go back to his real family. Last night, thanks to Hannibal's acquaintance, Will realized that Hannibal had not been idly picking at him with his comments about bringing his daughter and mistress to Hertford House. She surely would not stand for having Hannibal's child with Will under her care, and he imagined that Hannibal would send him off to another estate with their son, perhaps to live undisturbed there. Will's eyes misted at the thought, his vivid imagination showing him that the family and love he craved for so long could still yet be his. He had so much love to give that he could more than make up for the lack their son would surely have from Hannibal. And what if you gave him an Omega? Will bit his lip, anxiety clenching like a vice around him when he recalled what Hannibal had said, that he would feel compelled to drown it rather than force it to live in such a demeaning and debasing way. He would have every right to dispose of their child as he saw fit. It was an alpha's lawful place to cull their line for strength, though it had not been done in great families for centuries, not once wealth became plentiful and livelihoods were no longer threatened by a potential weak link in the chain. He would never, Will murmured to himself, absently rubbing his belly to soothe himself. Even he could not be so cruel. Yet he could not shake the memory of Hannibal seizing hold of him with such violence that Will had been sure he was facing the worst beating of his life, triggering a bond that had no place to exist between them. Nor could he shake the memory of the cold, careless way Hannibal had ordered him from the house, mortified and broken in just his underthings, spurned and exiled to the dangerous night and whatever fate might have in store for him. Perhaps there was not room enough in the heart of a man like Hannibal Lecter to show clemency to a baby whose helplessness would only incense him all the more for its gender. It was frightening enough that Will could not entertain the idea of a pregnancy, and grew even more determined to find better and stronger products that could mask his scent and keep him safe from inciting some accidental interest from his spouse before he could leave Hertford House. He heard Hannibal's voice, just a throaty, wordless rumble traveling from somewhere above him as he rose to start his day, and Will quickly slipped out the front door to wait in front of the house, hoping that Hannibal would not ask after his whereabouts. His mare was being led up, and Will moved out to meet her, mounting up some distance from the house, and taking up the basket that one of the kitchen maids scurried out with. Balancing it on his thighs, he clucked his mare into a brisk trot, and took one of the side trails from the estate, relaxing once he was sheltered in the thick wood. It was awkward, guiding the mare with one hand and keeping the hamper in place with the other, but he found a happy medium, and took the trail to the lane that led to Duxbury, hoping at least to tease some truth from the tangle he'd been given.